Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today we are going to be discussing the play by Moliere, Tartuffe. So let's go ahead and get started. So one very important thing to know about Tartuffe as a play in terms of the dramaturgical context is that it was written, Moliere worked, and this play was written under the rule of this fella, King Louis the 14th, Louis XIV. Um, he was the king of France from 1643 to 1715, 72 years. That is the longest of any monarch in recorded European history. Now, that sort of stability meant that he was powerful. He had exercised a lot of control over society. He was called things like the Sun King, right? Just because it seemed like everything in France kind of revolved around him. Um, he uh, he was known to have said, "The state, it's me," or "L'état, c'est moi," although that has been kind of disputed since the 19th century. But it seems like the type of thing he would say, right? As this king from a very long period of time, everything kind of was built around him. But it wasn't just because he, was there for a long time. He actually actively centralized um, rule in France. One example, a meaningful example, is the Palace of Versailles, right? And so he moved a lot of the French aristocracy. He built Versailles, which is a kind of a small kind of aristocratic town or retreat or something, but he built his palace there, and he decided to hold court down there. Now, he also had a whole bunch of kind of houses or little apartments, not little apartments, obviously, but because they're for the aristocracy, but apartments built so that if the aristocracy wanted to be next to the king, they had to come and pay a whole bunch of money to stay in these apartments. And the only way that they could afford these particular apartments is if they had the king's favor, right? And so, even though it was Versailles itself was imagine a very fun good place to be if you're a member of the aristocracy. One person said it was an irresistible combination of marriage market, employment agency, and entertainment capital of aristocratic Europe, boasting the best theater, opera, music, gambling, sex, and most important, hunting. Right, and so what that did is a couple of things. It made a whole bunch of the aristocracy. It made uh, their social capital tied very heavily with his personal favor. But it also kind of moved them out of their centers of power, right? The places where they were actually, lords, earls, dukes of what have you, and kind of put them in this place that's a little bit out of the way, where the king is the only thing that really matters. Louis XIV was also a very Catholic monarch. He drove underground French Protestantism, which we will kind of get to in just a minute, because the character of Tartuffe, in many ways, seems to be kind of an almost a Puritan in many ways. So, getting to Tartuffe itself. Now, this is on the left. There is a costume design for this. He's meant to be obviously a member of the clergy, and a kind of ascetic dress in sort of way, kind of personally. Uh, uh, he has kind of a personal forbearance on things. He does not do, he's not engaged in too many worldly things, and kind of keeps his eyes and his soul on the hereafter. Obviously, that is a complete lie, right? He is a imposter. He is a liar. He is a manipulator, a con man, right? But we all know that because we all read the play. This play was originally performed in Versailles in 1664, right? Obviously during the reign of Louis XIV. Um, King Louis personally enjoyed the play, but he actually forbade the performance of this play outside of Versailles, of course, because rules don't apply to rich people. Because he said the resemblance of vice to virtue could not be allowed to be abused by others, because obviously people who are not as sophisticated as the French aristocracy at the time, they would see this character of Tartuffe lying and getting, you know, getting his way for most of the play, and they would think, "Hey, this is a how-to manual. Um, this is a good idea to do." The Archbishop of Paris threatened excommunication to anyone who acted, read, or saw the play. Right. This play absolutely skewers religious figures, um, and says that blindly accepting that they are who they say they are and their piety and wisdom is foolish. Right. The character Orgon throughout the entire play, everyone else, except maybe Madame Parnell, thinks that he is a fool. Right. Especially the sassy maid. Um, so because of all these things, Moliere actually rewrote the play as L'Imposteur, right, the imposter, without kind of as much religious skewering, but no one really liked it. It was only performed once or twice. Um, so when we were talking about French neoclassicism, right, this is an example, right, of a play that follows a lot of those unities, right? When we talk about the unity of time, right, where French neoclassicism um, uh, thought that Aristotle meant, a play should take place in one period of time, ideally within 24 hours, right? This play absolutely does. By the time the play enters, by the time the king's envoy comes by at the end, right? That's just a day, right? Not much has happened. Uh, does the play follow the unity of place? Yeah, all of this takes place in Orgon's house, right? They don't jump around very much. Is there a unity of action? Sure, I would argue so. Um, Everything, including kind of the subplots, they are related directly to the plot of Tartuffe trying to fool Orgon and take over his house, right? The thing that could most be thought of as a subplot is the romantic, the two young lovers. Um, but really, that also has to do with her going to be married to Tartuffe eventually, and Orgon wanting to fold Tartuffe into his family proper. And so that's not really a subplot per se, right? It does absolutely have to do with that main trunk of the action. So unity of time, unity of place, unity of action, absolutely this play, I would say, does fulfill all of these. And so in terms of the unities, Cardinal Richelieu would be happy. Now, is there verisimilitude? Do people act the way that they normally or that they would necessarily? Now, sure, I would say largely, right? The character of Tartuffe is he's a miserable person and he's a bad guy, right? But he seems to be acting somewhat realistically based upon his character. I think that Orgon, we might think that he's very foolish, but he is at least consistent in that kind of foolishness. Now, one of the interesting things is that even though Aristotle wrote, again, I'll always come back to Aristotle. Even though Aristotle wrote the unities as kind of dealing specifically with tragedy, and this absolutely is not a tragedy. Tartuffe gets his comeuppance at the end. Um, but the French neoclassicists took that idea that Aristotle wrote about tragedy and expanded it to kind of all plays, right? And so this comedy was intentionally following the rules of neoclassicism. Now, at the end of the play, there is a sort of a Deus ex machina, right? Or I put a Rex ex machina because it's not a god; it's the king who comes in and saves everything, or at least the king's envoy, right? Where everything seems lost, but then a messenger from the king comes and says, "Oh, by the way, the king's been following what's been going on here, and he knows that Tartuffe is a terrible person, and so, you know, he's a criminal. We're going to arrest him instead." Now, this particular thing was not strictly following the unities, right? At least the neoclassical version of the unities, because there's a Deus ex machina, right? Someone comes in who hasn't been a part of the play from during the entire span of it, and just kind of like snaps their fingers and fixes everything. However, right, this was performed in Versailles, right? And so the king saw it. And if the king's favor was the most important thing in Versailles and in French high society at that time, if you have a choice either between following the classical unities and flattering the king, absolutely flatter the king, right? And so that's why when the king comes in, even though it's not Louis XIV by name in the play itself, when the person comes in and says like, yeah, the king is a smart guy and he's known all along and he's going to do the right thing, you know, you can imagine Louis liking that a lot and Moliere kind of thinking, yeah, he's going to like this. So it's okay if it's kind of a Deus ex machina. So That is Tartuffe. I'm actually going to give you a little bit more time for the quiz, just 'cause, yeah, until next Tuesday as well. In the meantime, you'll also be reading The Good Woman of Sichuan by Bertolt Brecht, which has another kind of Deus Ex Machina at the end. But you'll absolutely see it's a fun play. But yeah, so this particular quiz, it'll be due next week, not this week. So cool. Thank you all very much. Uh, Glad to see all those midterms in. Sounds great. I'll get to grading pretty soon. All right.